You know, Fight Club only looked successful from this point because when it was originally created as a book, it was a failure as a book. And it sold fewer than 5,000 copies in hardcover. And then when it was created as a movie, 3 years later, it was only in theaters for less than 2 weeks. It made very little money. It cost $100 million to make, another $20 million to market. And on the opening weekend, one of the producers called me and was weeping and said that it was tanking. He was hysterical. He said, the movie is tanking and we're all going to lose our jobs. Bill Mechanic lost his job as head of 20th Century Fox. And the movie lost an enormous amount of money to the studio. And the movie was a huge failure. It got some of the worst reviews of any movie ever. Rex Reed said, perhaps this movie will find its target audience in hell, because that's where it belongs. And it wasn't until a year or two later when Fox invested very heavily in producing a beautiful DVD version of it that it started to catch on, that it started to gain an audience. So it looks like a success from this point in history, but all along the way it was a huge failure. As a book, initially as a movie, it's been a failure a lot longer than it's been a success.
Lei però con 10 albi a fumetto ha continuato, ha realizzato un sequel di Fight Club, che è una cosa appunto diversa dal romanzo e diverso dal film, è una terza cosa, è una terza via. Ci può raccontare qualcosa appunto sugli albi a fumetto che ha realizzato?
You know, eventually the book had such a following, and the movie had such a following, that I knew if I was going to do a sequel, a continuation of the story, in either one of those forms, either a movie or a book, it would be compared to the original version, and it would fail. So I felt a continuation would have to be in a completely different medium, and so the next most obvious medium would be comics or graphic novels. And also I wanted to collaborate with people, with artists. And so writing a graphic novel was a way to work with people that lived very close to me, so that I wouldn't have to work in isolation on this project. And it was a way of having different strengths of storytelling. You know, movies are very good at showing things, and books are very good at telling things. But there are aspects of the graphic novel that if they were made literal enough to be filmed, they would be enormously offensive and emotionally devastating. But in a graphic novel, they could be drawn in such a way that they would occur as endearing or even comic, without having to be as literal as they would have to be for a film. So each medium has its own strengths, and in comics I got to play to the entirely different set of strengths than I could in either a novel or in a film.
Ci sono delle domande? Allora, andiamo di lì.
Salve. Cadevamo solo il parere dell'ingegnere. Volevo chiedere allo scrittore, quando lui scrive, se in qualche modo si immagina un'eventuale trasposizione cinematografica, cioè se già la vede mentre la scrive, e cosa ne pensa del fatto che molto spesso le persone sono deluse dalla trasposizione di un libro, perché quando si legge un libro si entra in empatia con il libro stesso e ciascuno si fa nella sua testa il proprio film ed è deluso quando lo vede perché sta vedendo il film che si è fatto nella testa invece del regista o lo sceneggiatore.
when I set out to write books, it was to write books and not to write films. And so I wanted to write the kind of books that would never be made into films. I wanted to write the kind of things that films could never broach. Because films have to make their return, have to make their profit by being shown to an enormous audience, many of whom aren't consenting to see the film. Where books are always a consensual form of entertainment. The person reading the book is always making an effort and always turning the pages and has to be educated to a certain extent to even understand what they're consuming. So, in writing books, I wanted to write about the things that I felt could never be filmed because they were too upsetting or too challenging or too offensive. And so my goal is to always write something that could never be made into a film. There's another portion of that question.
La seconda domanda è the second question.
You know, most people maybe, but I think especially in the case of Fight Club, the film and the book each stand as their own thing. And so I think that they're both very valid, and it's hard to compare them directly. And so I think in that case, they're both a very good thing. And it's hard to say that one is better than the other. People might have their preferences, but I could go online and find 1,000 places where people say some version of the movie is great, and I would not wipe my ass for the book. You can always find people who hate the book.
Prego.
Sì, sono passati 20 anni ormai dalla pubblicazione di Fight Club. Sono successe molte cose in America e nel mondo. Quella visione, quella critica, quel ritratto dell'America pensa che siano ancora validi, oppure tutto quello che è successo ha cambiato molto la realtà, insomma. E poi volevo chiederle, ho letto che quando c'è stata una lettura di un suo racconto, a questa lettura 67 persone sono svenute. Adesso l'ho letto su internet, quindi lo prendo con il beneficio di inventario, non so se sia vero oppure no, ma volevo chiederle quali sono le emozioni che lei punta a suscitare nei suoi lettori.
Boy, the first question is so enormous, I'm not even sure how to tackle even a portion of it. There's I can't think of the name, it's a hyphenated theory, 2 names with a hyphen. And it states that it's only once a distinction is given a name that we can talk about it. And I think until Fight Club and The Matrix, especially Fight Club and The Matrix, we didn't have a language for talking about so many aspects of the culture. And just these 2 movies that question a kind of stock reality, because most movies, most narratives take place in this kind of commonly held stock reality that we all think is reality. And very few movies kind of question that stock reality. And the Fight Club and The Matrix both created a language for questioning that stock reality. And it's only now that we have some of that language that we can talk about these ideas. And I think that's one reason why certain movements are starting, because before there was no language to even conceptualize them. The second part of the question was, Oh, about the faintings. Yeah, I have a story called Guts, and I read it for a few years on tour, and it was a very short 11-page story. And I read it in Milan once, and 3 men fainted, and one was so angry. He stood up at the end, he was weeping, he was so angry, and he was screaming in Italian, "Did you read that story just to humiliate me? Did you read that story just so I would faint and be humiliated?" And I felt bad for him. There was another man, there's a joke in there about calamari. If I told you how it tasted, you would never ever again eat calamari. And another man got up, just bellowing angry. And he said, "I make my living in the calamari industry." And again, my job is to show you how powerful a story can be. There's a famous horror writer in the US called Shirley Jackson. She died back in the 1960s, 1964. And Shirley Jackson is most famous for writing a novel called The Haunting of Hill House, which has been made into a couple different movies. Most recently, a movie with Catherine Zeta-Jones called The Haunting. But Shirley Jackson really found her place on the cultural landscape in the 1950s when she wrote a short story called The Lottery. And when the Lottery, this very simple short story, was published in the New Yorker, it offended people so deeply, it shocked them and frightened them so badly, that hundreds and hundreds of people canceled their subscriptions to the New Yorker. And I've always loved that story, and I've always thought, what would a story right now have to do to enrage people in the same way that Shirley Jackson's story, The Lottery, did in the 1950s? So I set out to write this story, Guts, that's very, very funny in the beginning. And it makes people laugh a lot before they realize where the story's actually going. And at that point, it's too late. They've been laughing, and they're completely disarmed. And once they realize what's actually happening, they do start to faint. There's never been one event where 60 people fainted. The most was 18 people fainted in the Brighton Corn Exchange in Brighton, England, one night. But for a long time, I kept a count, and around 72, around a total of 72 through one tour, I quit counting. But that was hundreds of people ago. And most recently, I read that story in, of all places, a synagogue in Washington, D.C., where I was asked to do a reading. And 5 people fainted. And I always want to show how powerful stories can be, without music, without acting, without scenery. The kind of stories that you used to hear as a child around a campfire or in front of a fire. Those stories that would frighten you so badly that you would remember them for the rest of your life. And my goal is always to try to create that kind of strength in a story, but for an adult audience. Yeah, I don't think that's a bad thing to do. Oh, so you should hear some of the true stories people tell me. They make my made-up stories look like nothing. So.
Ci sono delle domande? C'è una domanda qui davanti e lì.
Volevo chiedere allo scrittore com'è stata la collaborazione con Fincher e invece in relazione a un altro suo romanzo, ovvero Invisible Monsters, se ha mai pensato a chi potrebbe dirigere un eventuale adattamento. Grazie.
in regard to David Fincher, I'm not sure anybody really works with David Fincher. You just kind of agree with David Fincher. Yeah, he's got a vision, and he's a smart guy. And I think anytime you try to kind of second guess Fincher, you always run the risk of creating a worse product. Because if Fincher is suggesting something, there's a very good reason for it. And when they were first casting the Fight Club movie, Courtney Love was living with Edward Norton. And Courtney Love wanted that part very badly, and she was taking the executive producer, Art Linson, out to dinner. And she was acting and dressing like the character, and she was pretending to be Marla Singer because she really wanted to establish herself as the only Marla Singer possibility. But David Fincher thought that that was too obvious, and he thought casting against type would be much smarter. So he suggested Helena Bonham Carter, which kind of sounded ridiculous to the rest of us. But then David said, I want her to look just like Judy Garland did just before she died. You know how bad that was? With that ratted out hair where you could see all the scalp. And she'd always be wearing some sequin dress with half the sequins gone. And she'd be starved looking. I want her to look like that, like a dead Judy Garland. And she does. And he nailed it. And it's an iconic look. And David was right. So most of what I did with David was just defer. And there was also kind of an ongoing battle between David and Edward Norton. Because Edward wanted his character to be very, very sympathetic, to be really very likable for the audience to really engage with that character. But David thought that that was very secondary. He thought that that was kind of a cheap way out. David wanted the character to be very conflicting for the audience. So David wanted the character to be a lot less likable. And Edward wanted the character to be very likable. And more often than not, I would be enrolled on David's side, trying to argue that the character shouldn't be as likable. Because the character is doing a really despicable thing, trying to get his emotional needs met without having to express any kind of nurturing or caring for the strangers that are nurturing him because they think he's dying. So the character is pretty sleazy on an emotional level and completely inauthentic throughout the movie. But David recognized that, and Edward Norton didn't want to play that. So most of that is just agreeing with David. And Invisible Monsters has been optioned and developed by so many different entities. And right now, the people who made the first season of American Horror Story have it. And I think of any creative group so far, that they're the most likely, they have the best resources and the best aesthetic for turning that into a feature film. So the American Horror Story people from the FX network, from the first season, are developing monsters into a movie. Thank you.
Sì, salve, Francesco Gallo, Agenzia ANSA. Lei, diciamo, in molti suoi racconti, molti suoi libri ha parlato di violenza. Volevo sapere se lei dovesse dare una definizione di violenza, che tipo di comunicazione c'è nella violenza, se c'è una comunicazione?
Well, first, for me, the violence is always consensual. It's always two people agreeing in a very structured way that they're going to engage in what looks like a violent act. You know, that's why Fight Club had so many rules. And for a way, myself and so many of my peers in my generation had shied away from violence and conflict all of our lives. And I wanted to create a kind of setting in which we could engage with violence to a very careful, consensual degree. That we could begin to experience larger and larger amounts of violence to find out what we were capable, not so much of inflicting, but of enduring, to find out just how powerful we were in surviving something. So in a way, Fight Club was this consensual, gradual game of experiencing violence, but always consensual, always a game. But on a larger level, all of my books include some very physical element, because I want to engage the reader on not just an intellectual or an emotional level, but also on a gut physical level. And so the things that do that are violence, or sex, or drugs, or illness. And so if you can really unpack those elements, you can create a sympathetic reaction within the reader, and the reader will experience the experience of the drug, or the sex, or the violence, or the illness. And that's one way of fully involving the reader on a physical as well as an emotional and intellectual level. So violence is just one element I play with, and I only play with that just because I want to always have something very physical in a story.
C'erano delle domande, c'era una domanda ce l'aveva prima, sì.
Thank you. I'll do it in English. Hi Chuck. My name is Mike. I'm for Square Magazine. I'm one of the backers of Lullaby Project. I was at a gold door shop a month ago. So, of course, I was following fugitives and refugees. And by the way, during my journey, I realized what a unique and lucky combination has been having you growing up over there and not anywhere else, mixing the beautiful weirdness of the Pacific Northwest with your mind and your spirit. So, have you ever wondered what could have happened if you had lived anywhere else, let's say in Tupelo, Tennessee, instead of the Pacific Northwest? What could have happened to your writing career? Thank you.
You know, I pretty much was raised in Tupelo, Mississippi. I was raised in a little, very small town of 600 people, far, far to the east of the Northwest, in the desert, where there's very few people, very few animals, very little anything. And I went to Portland to get a degree in journalism at a time when there were no jobs in journalism. And so I ended up getting a factory job for years and years. And then I did a motivational course called the Landmark Forum. And it impressed upon me that if I wanted to be a writer, I shouldn't wait until I was 65 or 70, because that was my goal. My plan was to work in the factory until I was 65 or 70, and then I would start to study to become a writer. And Landmark taught me that I shouldn't put it off. I should start my dream right away. But I needed a group of people to support me. So I joined a writer's class. And it was a nice class, I was maybe 27, and the class consisted mostly of nice ladies who had doctor husbands. Okay, it was all nice ladies with doctor husbands, and they were all in their 40s and 50s, and they were all writing mystery novels. And I was writing horrible stuff. And I brought in a scene that eventually got used in my book, Snuff, where a kid he's ordered an inflatable sex doll that looks exactly like the porn star that he's in love with. And he realizes as he's having sex with it, he realizes that he's snagged the back of it while undoing the zipper in the back of its dress. And it's got a small hole and it's gradually losing all of its air. So he's having to copulate faster and faster, trying to achieve his orgasm before the entire thing goes flat. And even as he has his orgasm, his mother steps into the room and he stands up, and the whole deflated sex doll is hanging off of his erection like this big pink flag. And after that, the leader of our writing group took me aside and said that many of the writers in the groups were no longer felt safe in my presence. So they were asking me to leave the group. But there was a new group in town, a man named Tom Spanbauer, who had studied at Columbia University in New York. He'd studied a style of writing called minimalism from an editor named Gordon Lish. And Gordon Lish is most famous for being the editor who helped Raymond Carver create his very stripped down, very stark style. So Tom had all of the Lish rules that had benefited Raymond Carver, and Tom had moved to Portland and he was teaching a writing workshop. So I took Tom's workshop. And I think more than Portland or the Northwest or anything, the fact that my path crossed with the path of Tom Spanbauer, that is what turned me into a writer. Because there are so many really great writing courses that are about writing, but so few writing courses that teach you how to write better every time you go. And Tom's course was extraordinary. So it's not necessarily a Northwest thing. It's more of I was lucky to grow up and cross paths with Tom Spanbauer thing. And that could have been in Mississippi or wherever. Thank you.
Dobbiamo fermarci qui. Grazie a tutti.